Welcome, dear listener, to Whispers of the Night. We invite you to journey with us through the quiet corridors of time, into a world where memories linger and stories wait to be discovered. Before we begin, take a deep breath, settle into your space, and let the day's thoughts drift away. If you enjoy drifting into calm, gentle stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Whispers of the Night and tap the bell so you never miss a moment of rest and reflection. Tonight's story, The Whispers from a Bygone Era, is a tale of secrets carried by an old house, echoes of lives lived long ago, and the quiet presence of those who came before. Let's begin and allow your mind to rest as the whispers unfold. Close your eyes gently and feel the weight of the day begin to lift. Imagine a house at the edge of a misty village, old and worn, yet filled with the warmth of stories that have lingered for centuries. Walk slowly through its hallways, where the floorboards creak softly beneath your feet, and let your mind notice the whisper-soft echoes of lives that have come and gone. You don't need to understand them fully, just let them reach you like a gentle breeze. Don't now step into the garden at dawn. Feel the dew under your fingers, the petals of flowers glistening like tiny jewels, and hear the faint rustle of leaves. Each sound is a sigh of history, a reminder that you are not alone in your thoughts, and that memory is alive all around you. With every breath, let yourself sink deeper into calm. Inhale the lingering scents of lavender, soft earth, and morning mist, and exhale any tension, letting the past guide you into stillness. Imagine a portrait in a quiet room, eyes that seem to meet yours, watching gently, approving but not intruding. Feel the presence of those who came before, and know that their stories are safe. As is your peace, let your body sink into comfort. Feel the warmth of blankets, the gentle hum of the night, and the lingering light of morning touching every surface. You are at peace. You are part of the quiet continuity of the world around you. The whispers are here, soft, gentle, and slowly, as you rest, they begin to fade into calm, leaving only serenity in their place. The Whispers from a Bygone Era. The house that remembers. Eleanor's carriage rumbled along the winding road that led to the village of her childhood, the familiar landscape emerging through the early morning fog in hazy gray silhouettes. The trees, skeletal yet solemn, seemed to bow toward the narrow lane as if recognizing her return. She pressed her hand against the cold window of the carriage, feeling the faint tremor of both anticipation and unease that stirred within her chest. It had been more than a decade since she had last seen the manor, and the years had worn differently on the world than they had on her memories. The village lay cloaked in silence, each thatched roof and crooked fence framed by a mist that seemed to carry the weight of old stories, secrets whispered from generations past. As the carriage drew closer, Eleanor's heart quickened. Through the fog, she glimpsed the familiar outline of the manor, dark against the pale sky, its once grand facade softened by the passage of time. Windows, framed in peeling white paint, stared back like eyes that had witnessed the ebb and flow of countless lives. Ivy clung stubbornly to the stone walls, tendrils wrapping around corners and curling upward as if protecting the house from the outside world. The air smelled of damp earth and decayed leaves, mingled with a faint trace of smoke from chimneys long abandoned. Each breath she drew was steeped in the scent of memory, a perfume both comforting and melancholy. The carriage wheels ground to a halt on the gravel driveway. Eleanor stepped down, her boots crunching softly against the stones. The silence around her was thick, almost tangible, as though the world had held its breath while she returned. She let her gaze wander over the front door, the same dark wood with its iron knocker shaped like a lion's head. She remembered grasping it as a child, imagining the roar of the beast shaking the very foundation of the house. Now the knocker felt heavy in her hand, cold and solid, a reminder that time had not waited for anyone, not even her. Pushing the door open, she was greeted by the familiar scent of aged wood and dust, mingled with the faintest hint of lavender, her mother's favorite scent, preserved somehow despite the years. The floorboards groaned under her weight, each creak a greeting from the house itself, an acknowledgement of her presence after so long. Sunlight filtered through the tall, narrow windows, casting muted patterns of gold and gray across the walls. The manor seemed to exhale, a deep, resonant sound of sighing wood and settling stone. It was as if the house had been waiting for her, anticipating her return in ways she could not quite articulate. Eleanor's eyes roamed over the interior. The grand hallway stretched before her, lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her movements. Faces of ancestors long gone stared back at her, some with stern expressions, others softer, almost wistful. She ran her fingers lightly along the carved banister of the staircase, feeling the smooth grooves worn into the wood by countless hands over the centuries. Each step up the staircase was a journey through her own memories, sunlight streaming through the windows during summer afternoons, the muffled sound of rain tapping on the roof during long winter evenings, the echoes of laughter and whispered conversations that had once filled these halls. The drawing room still held its old charm. The furniture, though worn, retained the elegance of a bygone era. A faded velvet armchair, a grand piano with keys that no longer sang as clearly as they once had, and a hearth with the faintest traces of soot from fires long extinguished. Eleanor moved slowly, touching the spines of books on the shelves, their titles etched in gold that had dulled over time. She paused at a small cabinet, its surface polished to a gentle sheen by her mother's diligent care before the house had been left to quiet neglect. Inside, she found old letters, yellowed with age, their ink faded, yet still legible, whispering stories of love, loss, and resilience. Her fingers trembled as she traced the delicate handwriting, imagining the lives that had poured themselves onto the paper, lives connected to hers by blood and memory. A faint sound drew her attention. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, soft rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor. Eleanor held her breath, listening. The sound grew slightly, then faded again, leaving her with the echo of her own heartbeat. She reminded herself that the house had always been alive in its own way, creaking and sighing in response to the passage of time. Yet there was something different tonight, a whisper that seemed almost intentional, a subtle beckoning that sent a shiver down her spine. She walked to the window and peered out, the fog curling around the edges of the manor's grounds like a living thing. The garden had grown wild, untamed since the last time she had tended to it as a child. Roses, their colors muted by the mist, leaned toward the paths as though seeking guidance. A marble fountain, now cracked and moss-covered, stood at the center, its waters stagnant yet shimmering faintly with reflected light. Eleanor remembered playing near that fountain, throwing coins and making wishes she had long forgotten. The garden seemed to murmur back at her, each leaf and branch holding a memory, each shadow a fragment of the past. She made her way to the library, a room that had always been her sanctuary. The heavy door protested as she pushed it open, revealing shelves lined with tomes, some of them rare, their pages smelling of dust and the faint tang of ink. Light fell unevenly across the room, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny spirits in the air. Eleanor ran her hands along the spines of the books, recognizing familiar titles and recalling afternoons spent immersed in stories that transported her far beyond the manor walls. It was here, in this very room, that she had first discovered the power of imagination, the magic of words that could bend time and space, and the solace of stories that understood her heart. As evening approached, the house seemed to shift. Shadows lengthened, stretching across walls and floors, merging with the lingering mist that had followed her inside. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, a sensation that brushed against her skin like the ghost of a remembered touch. She lit a candle, the small flame flickering and casting playful, dancing light against the walls. The shadows seemed to respond, stretching and curling in ways that were both familiar and unsettling. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, carrying tones that seemed almost like voices, softly calling, softly remembering. She could not tell whether they were memories trapped in the wood and stone, echoes of lives long past, or her own imagination weaving the house's secrets into audible form. Despite the unease, Eleanor felt a deep, unshakable connection to this place. It was home in every sense of the word, not merely a shelter, but a living record of generations, a keeper of joys and sorrows, of laughter and tears. She realized that the house had been waiting, not for anyone, but for her. She was the last in a line of caretakers, the one who could walk these halls and honor the silence that had gathered in the corners. The thought brought both comfort and weight, a responsibility interwoven with the warmth of belonging. Night fell fully, and the manor was cloaked in a darkness that was softened only by the candlelight flickering across the walls. The whispers grew more insistent, like a symphony of echoes weaving through the beams and panels. Eleanor sat in the armchair by the hearth, the candle casting a halo of light around her, and allowed herself to breathe in the history, the stories, the very essence of the house. She could hear the floorboards sigh, the wind pressing against the windows, and within it all, a rhythm that felt like life itself. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memories settle around her like a comforting quilt, and felt the presence of all those who had come before. It was as though the house was speaking to her, welcoming her back into the fold of its long and quiet lineage. Hours slipped by unnoticed. The candle burned low, its wax forming tiny rivers along the sides, and Eleanor remained in her seat, listening to the soft cadence of the house. She imagined the ancestors walking these halls, their lives intertwined with her own, their joys and regrets imprinted upon the walls. She felt a sudden urge to write, to capture the whispers, the fleeting moments of memory that the house offered before they faded into silence again. The candlelight flickered one last time and went out, leaving her in darkness, punctuated only by the moonlight streaming through the windows. Even in darkness, the house seemed alive, breathing, remembering, and in that moment, Eleanor understood that she too had become part of its story, a chapter woven seamlessly into the enduring narrative of the manor. When dawn approached, the first hints of light crept through the fog, casting a pale glow over the manor and its overgrown gardens. Eleanor stood at the window, looking out at the village that had once been her entire world. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and new beginnings. She felt a renewed sense of belonging, a quiet strength derived from the knowledge that she had returned to where she was always meant to be. The whispers, though faint, continued as the day broke, carrying with them the echoes of a bygone era. And Eleanor listened, ready to answer, ready to remember, and ready to live within the embrace of a home that had never truly let her go. Letters in the cedar chest. Eleanor ascended the narrow staircase that led to the attic, each step a deliberate negotiation with age-worn wood. The air grew cooler and heavier with every ascent, thick with the scent of dust and time long untroubled. Cobwebs stretched across low beams, delicate as spider thread lace, their silvery strands quivering in the faint currents of air she brought with her movement. She hesitated at the attic doorway, hand resting lightly on the rough-hewn frame, and peered into the dim space beyond. The attic was a cathedral of shadows, lit by a single candle she had brought from the drawing room. Its flame wavered, casting irregular shapes across the walls, sending relics and furniture alike into eerie, flickering life. Stacks of trunks, trunks within trunks, and crates overflowing with cloth, porcelain, and tarnished silver seemed to breathe in the candlelight, each artifact holding its own quiet story. Dust motes floated in the beam, moving lazily like tiny spirits, catching her attention as they danced in patterns that felt almost intentional, almost sentient. Her eyes were drawn to a cedar chest tucked beneath the sloped roof, the kind of chest that promised secrets and memories, its surface worn smooth by decades of care and neglect. The scent of cedar was strong, aromatic, and grounding, mingled with the subtle tang of old paper. Eleanor knelt in front of it, her fingers tracing the edges of the carved lid. It felt heavier than she remembered, as though the years themselves had settled within, pressing down on the hidden contents. The chest creaked in protest as she lifted the lid, revealing a nest of letters tied in faded ribbons, yellowed with age and edged with the brittle tears of time. She carefully untied the first bundle. The handwriting startled her. It was precise, deliberate, and unlike anything she had seen before. Looping letters that hinted at a formal education, yet carried a personal intimacy, the kind of mark left by someone pouring their heart onto paper. Eleanor's chest tightened with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She hesitated, then drew the letter close, inhaling the faint scent of lavender and ink, a perfume that felt eerily familiar. The words on the page seemed to pulse with life, and Eleanor felt as though the writer had known her, had seen into the recesses of her mind. The letter spoke of fears she had long buried, the loneliness that gnawed at her during sleepless nights, the relentless questioning of her place in the world, the quiet yearning for understanding and belonging. Yet it also spoke to her hopes, the fragile, delicate dreams that she had held close since childhood, the quiet wish to be understood and accepted, the courage to face the shadows both outside and within. With trembling hands, she continued through the bundle, reading letters that spanned decades, each one more intimate than the last. The author's voice wove through time, addressing Eleanor with a tenderness that was almost tangible, as if the paper itself carried warmth. She wondered who had written them, how the letters had found their way into the chest, and why they spoke to her so directly, as though the author had known her soul intimately, decades before she herself had come to understand it. Some letters were brimming with hope and encouragement, offering solace during imagined nights of sorrow. Others were tinged with melancholy, whispering of losses suffered and mistakes regretted, of love given and returned in ways both fleeting and profound. Eleanor felt a kinship with the unknown author, a bridge across time that connected to hearts in ways words alone could not fully describe. She noticed recurring mentions of the manor, of its walls and rooms, of its gardens and skies, described with a precision that suggested long hours spent within its bounds. Curiosity tugged at her. Who had these letters been for? How had they ended up hidden in the cedar chest? Eleanor searched the chest more thoroughly, lifting each bundle, unfolding each page, sometimes finding small trinkets tucked inside pressed flowers, fragments of ribbon, delicate sketches of the manor and its a folded note fell into her lap, containing only a single line written in the same flowing hand. To find the house is to find yourself. Eleanor read it twice, feeling a shiver run along her spine. The words resonated deeply, striking a chord that seemed to echo the silent whispers she had felt in the walls the night before. She lingered in the attic for hours, moving between bundles of letters, inhaling their faint scent, feeling the textures of the paper, absorbing the nuances of each sentence. The candle burned low, leaving a halo of golden light around her, but she paid little attention to the approaching evening. She was caught in the intimacy of the past, the conversations of a heart long departed that nonetheless spoke directly to her own. Each letter seemed to unfold a layer of the house itself, revealing not only its secrets, but its essence, its capacity for memory, its willingness to hold and share the lives of those who had lived within it. At one point, Eleanor paused to rest her head against the chest. The cedar smelled warm and soothing, a fragrant embrace that seemed to cradle her in the continuity of time. She closed her eyes, imagining the hands that had written these letters, the quiet moments in which they had been composed, the intimacy of the act, the pen moving across paper, the breathing in the candlelit room, the careful folding and tying of each letter with ribbons, spoke of devotion and reflection. She could almost feel the rhythm of the author's life, the heartbeat beneath the ink, the weight of emotion pressed into each curve of the letters. Eleanor realized that the letters did not merely recount events or express thoughts. They invited her into a dialogue across time. The author posed questions indirectly, reflections on fear, courage, and the subtle choices that shape a life. There were lines that spoke of doubt, tempered by resilience, passages that described loss, softened by memory, confessions of longing, tempered by hope. She felt herself responding silently, her own thoughts and emotions rising to meet the words, as if the pages could sense her presence and adapt to her understanding. As night fully embraced the manor, the attic seemed to transform. Shadows lengthened and shifted, weaving between trunks and beams, as though animated by the stories themselves. The candlelight flickered with a life of its own, casting delicate, moving patterns across the walls, illuminating a room that seemed less a repository of objects and more a living archive of emotions. Eleanor felt the boundaries of time dissolve, the letters bridging the gap between past and present, weaving her into the tapestry of the house's memory. She found one final bundle, smaller than the others, tied with a thread so fragile it threatened to crumble at her touch. She opened it carefully, revealing letters that differed slightly in tone. The handwriting was the same, yet the words carried an urgency, a deeper vulnerability. They spoke of fears that mirrored her own most closely, the anxiety of returning, of facing memory and loss, of confronting the silence of absence. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as she read, the writer's voice tenderly urging her forward, encouraging her to embrace the manifold experiences of life with courage and compassion. The attic grew colder as the night deepened, yet Eleanor felt a warmth in her chest she had not anticipated. The letters were more than artifacts. They were companions, confidants, mentors from a past that had reached across decades to meet her in this singular moment. She pressed one to her heart, inhaling the scent of cedar and ink, and felt a profound sense of belonging. The house, in its quiet way, had guided her to this discovery, offering not only memories, but wisdom, intimacies, and a reminder of the unseen connections that shape every life. At last, Eleanor rose, her arms full of letters, and gently replaced them in the chest. She ran her fingers over the lid one final time, feeling the grooves worn smooth by generations. The attic seemed to sigh, a sound that was almost human in its resonance, carrying with it a sense of completion and continuity. She knew that these letters would remain here, safe, waiting for another moment of discovery, another seeker of truth, until the next soul came seeking dialogue with the past. Eleanor descended the attic staircase slowly, the candlelight flickering behind her, leaving shadows that danced like memories on the walls. She placed the letters on a small table in the drawing room, arranging them with care, and sat for a long while, reflecting on the intimacy she had shared with an unknown author. Across time, the whispers of the manor had shifted. They no longer felt distant or strange. Instead, they seemed alive with possibility, encouraging her to listen, to learn, and to become part of the ongoing story of the house. The night was deep now, quiet, except for the soft sighing of the walls and the faint rustle of leaves outside. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the letters before her, and felt a rare peace settle over her. She understood, finally, that the house remembered not only the lives that had passed through it, but also the hearts that were willing to engage with its memory. And as she closed her eyes, she felt the soft brush of time itself, whispering reassurance, curiosity, and the gentle intimacy of connection that endures beyond absence, beyond years, beyond even death. Voices beneath the floorboards. Night had settled over the manor like a velvet curtain, thick and still, muffling the world beyond its walls. Eleanor walked quietly along the long corridor that stretched through the heart of the house, the glow of a single lantern cradled in her hands. Its light flickered across the paneling, revealing the subtle imperfections of aged wood. The faint scars of years and lives lived within. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, each door a promise of discovery or memory, each shadow a whisper of what had come before. The air smelled faintly of soot and lavender, a lingering scent from candles burned long ago. Eleanor's footsteps made no sound on the thick carpet, but even in silence, she felt the house respond. The walls seemed to hum softly, a vibration that traveled through the floorboards and into the soles of her feet, as though the very structure of the manor held memories pressed deep into its timbers. She paused at the midpoint of the corridor, feeling a chill that was not entirely the night air. Leaning slightly closer to the floor, she caught the faintest murmurous sound, like voices, soft and layered, just beneath her feet. Her heart quickened. Eleanor knelt and pressed her hand gently against the floorboards. There it was again, fragments of conversation, as though women from another century were speaking across the barrier of time. Their words brittle and fragmented, yet imbued with urgency. She listened intently, trying to discern meaning in the soft syllables. The voices were delicate, careful, layered with the caution of those who lived lives constrained by expectation and silence. There were moments of laughter, sudden and fleeting, followed by sighs that seemed to carry decades of restraint. Eleanor realized she was hearing stories not told in any books, stories of women who had moved silently through these halls, their lives hidden from the broader world, yet etched indelibly into the fabric of the house. She imagined them at work, polishing silver, tending gardens, reading letters by candlelight, sewing, mending, waiting. Each sound was a breadcrumb, a fragment of life preserved by the very floorboards she knelt upon. Her curiosity drew her further along the corridor, past doors she had once opened as a child, doors that now seemed to guard secrets more precious than any locked chest. She traced her fingers along the woodwork, feeling the grain beneath her fingertips, imagining the hands that had touched these surfaces before her. The murmurs persisted, sometimes urgent, sometimes soft, blending into a tapestry of sound that only she seemed able to hear. It was as though the house itself had begun to speak, offering not just memory, but counsel, a narrative of lives lived quietly, yet profoundly, within its embrace. At the end of the corridor, a narrow door led to a small crawl space beneath the floor. Eleanor hesitated, the lantern light trembling in her hands as she considered what she might find. The house seemed to hold its breath, the murmurings beneath her feet growing clearer as if encouraging her to step closer. She knelt and eased open the door, revealing a passage so low that she had to bend nearly double to enter. Dust rose in faint spirals, motes glowing in the lantern light, carrying the scent of time itself, aged wood, earth, and the faint aroma of dried flowers. Inside the crawl space, Eleanor moved slowly, letting her hands brush against the low ceiling and walls, feeling every groove and nick carved into the wood. The voices beneath the floorboards became more distinct here, patterns emerging from the murmurs. She heard fragments of conversation lines spoken in joy, in sorrow, in quiet defiance. They will not understand, but we must keep our hearts. The garden will bloom. Even if we do not, I wish I could speak freely. Each phrase hung in the air, fragile and powerful, as though the women who had lived here had left behind echoes of themselves to be discovered centuries later. Eleanor felt a profound connection with them. These voices, long suppressed, were not angry or sorrowful alone. They were patient, resilient, even tender. They spoke of love quietly nurtured, of ambitions quietly stifled, of courage that existed in small, unseen moments. She could almost feel their presence pressing softly against the walls and floors, a gentle insistence that their stories, though hidden, mattered. The house, she realized, had become a vessel for these histories, a keeper of truths that had been too fragile or too constrained to survive elsewhere. She sat cross-legged on the floor of the crawl space, letting the murmurs wash over her. Each fragment of conversation seemed to answer unspoken questions in her own heart, the fear and uncertainty she had carried along with her from the world above. She felt the weight of centuries settle around her, not as oppression, but as intimacy. These were lives that had passed quietly, yet had made their presence known in the texture of the walls, the timbre of the floorboards, the very resonance of the air. Eleanor imagined the women moving silently through these corridors, sewing, writing, tending fires, reading in the small hours, whispering to each other in hushed tones that now reached her ears across the vast expanse of time. Hours seemed to stretch and fold in this hidden space. Eleanor heard echoes of lullabies, fragments of confidences shared under candlelight, whispers of grief soothed by delicate hope. She realized that she was no longer merely listening. She was participating in the memory, part of a continuum of awareness that transcended her own fleeting presence. The house had opened itself to her, revealing histories that had been too quiet for the world, but too alive to be forgotten. At one point, she felt a subtle movement beneath her palms, a vibration so slight she could have mistaken it for her own heartbeat. The voices grew in clarity, almost forming complete sentences. You must remember us, our joys and our fears. Each choice matters. Even if unseen, we are part of this house. And now, you are part of us. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. The voices were not haunting in the way of fear, but haunting in the sense of presence. A calm insistence that the lives which had once been hidden were significant and enduring. When she finally rose to leave the crawl space, Eleanor felt a deep reverence for the house that had housed so many silent lives. She closed the narrow door carefully, listening as the murmurs faded into the quiet hum of the house, settling. The corridor felt different, now larger yet warmer, filled with an invisible resonance of shared history. Every step she took reverberated, with connection, each footfall a rhythm in the ongoing story of women who had lived, endured, and loved quietly within these walls. Returning to her room, Eleanor paused in the hallway, resting her hand against the cool wood of the banister. She imagined the women moving alongside her, unseen but not absent, their presence folded into the very structure of the manor. The realization brought a strange comfort, a sense that the house had always been alive in this way, its memory extending beyond mere bricks and mortar, carrying the lives and voices of those who had once walked its corridors. She lay awake that night, listening. Outside, the wind whispered against the panes, but within, the house had its own rhythms, its own music, the subtle creaks of floorboards, the sighs of settling beams, the murmurs beneath the boardsall spoke of continuity, of life woven quietly through generations. Eleanor closed her eyes, imagining the hands that had polished silver, that had tied ribbons on letters, that had prepared meals or read quietly by candlelight. She felt the pulse of their presence in the rhythm beneath her own heartbeat, and she drifted into sleep, feeling intimately connected to those who had lived silently yet profoundly before her in the quiet hours before dawn. Eleanor dreamed of the voices beneath the floorboards. They were no longer fragmented whispers, but entire conversations, weaving stories of resilience, small triumphs, and subtle acts of courage. She saw glimpses of women moving gracefully through candlelit halls, writing letters to unknown recipients, whispering lullabies, tending to gardens in hidden courtyards, and laughing softly at the quirks of life that had been theirs alone to witness. The dreams were calm and soothing, carrying with them a sense of belonging, of history made personal, of time bending to accommodate memory. When morning light seeped into the corridor, Eleanor rose and moved through the house with newfound awareness. She recognized the weight of stories carried in every corner, the faint indentations on the hearth where a woman's knees had pressed while tending a fire, the slight discoloration on the stair treads where many had ascended and descended, the grooves in the banister polished smooth by countless hands. These were the remnants of lives that had existed quietly, but had shaped the essence of the manor irrevocably. Eleanor paused at the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the misty garden. She felt the voices beneath the floorboards, not as an echo of the past, but as a present force, a lineage of experience that now included her own. The house had offered her intimacy with history, a communion with women who had lived silently, and she understood the gravity of their gift. To listen was to honor them. To remain was to participate in the continuation of memory itself. She stepped back into the corridor, the air filled with the soft resonance of life remembered. The manor was not merely a structure, it was a living archive, a vessel of intimate histories and a quiet testament to endurance. Eleanor's footsteps merged with the echoes beneath the floorboards, her presence a new thread woven into the tapestry of memory. In the quiet calm of the house, she understood that to live here was to listen, to witness, and to carry forward the unspoken stories that had long waited for someone to hear them. The day unfolded slowly, but Eleanor's mind remained tethered. to the voices beneath the floorboards. She resolved to walk the halls with care, to move gently through the spaces shaped by countless lives, to honor the histories that had survived in silence. And as she walked, she realized that the manor itself had become a companion, a guide, and a keeper of truths too delicate for any other medium. By nightfall, the murmurs had softened, settling into gentle echoes that lingered beneath her feet. Eleanor lit a candle in the corridor, its flame steady and warm. She paused, listening to the quiet cadence of the house, each creak and sigh a reminder of what had come before. And in that haunting calm, she found a profound peace, a connection that spanned centuries, a continuum of lives entwined, and a promise that the voices beneath the floorboards would always be there for those willing to hear. The portrait that watches. Eleanor wandered through the manor's upper gallery, the air cool and still, carrying a faint scent of oil paint and aged canvas. The room stretched long and narrow, its walls lined with portraits that had faded, two muted shades of ochre and gray, the faces of long-departed ancestors looking down with quiet solemnity. She ran her fingers lightly along the polished railing that separated the walking path from the walls, tracing the subtle grooves of generations who had walked these halls before her. The candlelight flickered along the gallery, casting the faces in shifting expressions, sometimes severe, sometimes tender, as though the paintings themselves responded to the observer's presence. Eleanor's eyes scanned the portraits methodically, noting each detail, the intricate lace of a collar, the delicate embroidery on a sleeve, the glimmer of jewels whose value had long since faded into history. Most faces seemed familiar in a distant, ancestral way, yet none of them spoke to her the way one particular portrait did. It was an unassuming painting, not the grandest of the gallery, but something about it drew Eleanor like a magnet. She stopped, heart beating slightly faster, and stared. The woman in the portrait had Eleanor's eyes, soft gray, reflective, and intelligent, staring straight from the canvas with an intensity that felt uncanny. For a moment, Eleanor felt a jolt of recognition, a shiver that traced her spine. She blinked and looked away, certain her imagination was playing tricks. But when she looked back, the gaze remained steady, knowing, almost alive. The lips curved faintly, a hint of a smile, not mocking, but deliberate, intimate, and quietly defiant. She circled the portrait slowly, examining it from every angle. The brushstrokes were meticulous, capturing the textures of hair, the subtle curve of a jaw, the lifelike glimmer in the eyes. Eleanor felt as though the woman were silently observing not just her form, but her mind, aware of her thoughts. The intensity of the gaze was not frightening. It was empowering, a recognition of shared consciousness across centuries. Eleanor noticed the plaque beneath the painting. Its letters faded. Marielle, 1784 to 1821. No surname, no titles, nothing more to situate this woman in history. It was as if the life she had lived had been deliberately minimized, erased from records, her story reduced to dates, and a single portrait. Eleanor's curiosity deepened. She ran her fingers along the frame, the polished wood warm under her touch. Feeling the subtle grooves carved by hands long gone, she imagined Marielle standing here once, posing for the painter, aware that this depiction would one day outlive her, a silent witness to all she would endure and defy. The gallery seemed to hum softly as Eleanor stood there, the candlelight flickering along the walls and casting gentle shadows. The air itself felt charged, as if memory had pooled within these walls, drawn to this painting in particular. Eleanor leaned closer, studying the fine details of Marielle's attire. The high collar that spoke of social expectation, the muted colors suggesting modesty, and yet the subtle tilt of the head, the small, assured lift of the chin, the glimmer in the eyes. These were markers of rebellion, subtle yet unmistakable. Marielle had lived carefully within her heiress constraints, yet she had claimed her individuality in ways that had been deliberately hidden from history. Eleanor could almost hear the faint rustle of silk, the soft echo of footsteps in a corridor. From centuries past, she closed her eyes, letting the presence of the woman in the portrait envelop her, imagining the life that had been lived here in quiet defiance. She felt the weight of Marielle's choices, the courage required to navigate a world that demanded silence and obedience, the quiet strength that manifested not in loud proclamations, but in the small acts of independence that defined her existence. She opened her eyes again and noticed a small notebook tucked behind the painting's frame, partially hidden. Eleanor reached for it, carefully pulling it free. Its cover was worn leather, the edges softened by time and handling. She opened it and found delicate handwriting, the same gray ink faded with age. The words were Marielle's, her thoughts, her observations, her reflections, recorded in secret. Eleanor read, "I am not meant to vanish quietly. Even if my name is forgotten, my choices must endure. I will live through memory, if not through history." Eleanor's chest tightened. The notebook revealed the intimate interior life of a woman whose existence had been denied acknowledgement, whose courage had been silenced by the pressures of society. Marielle's words spoke to Eleanor directly, acknowledging fears she had held since childhood, the fear of invisibility, the fear of being unheard, the quiet despair that one's life might not matter. And yet, Marielle's defiance, recorded so carefully, breathed life into Eleanor's own sense of agency. It was a reminder that courage need not be loud, that rebellion could exist in subtlety and endurance. Hours passed as Eleanor explored the gallery, cross-referencing the details. In Marielle's notebook, with the portraits that lined the walls, she began to notice patterns, subtle clues left by women who had preceded her, small symbols painted into the hems of dresses, secret inscriptions hidden in the folds of fabric, and deliberate choices in posture and gaze. These details, almost invisible to the casual observer, spoke of lives lived consciously, deliberately, in resistance to erasure. Eleanor realized that the house itself had preserved these legacies, giving voice to women whose names might have been lost, but whose actions remained encoded in the architecture, the art, and the very air. The more Eleanor read, the more she felt herself entwined with these women. The gallery was no longer merely a room of paintings. It was a space of communion, a site where past courage and present consciousness intertwined. Marielle's gaze followed her still, unwavering, as if acknowledging her understanding, accepting her presence, and granting Eleanor permission to inherit the strength she had so quietly preserved. As night deepened, the gallery's shadows lengthened, and Eleanor felt the soft pull of sleep. She placed the notebook back behind the portrait, a quiet offering to history, and stood before Marielle's eyes one last time. The candlelight flickered, casting delicate highlights across the brushstrokes, illuminating the subtle curve of the lips and the spark in the gray eyes. Eleanor felt a profound recognition, an unspoken bond, a sense that she had found a mirror, not just of her own features, but of her own potential for quiet strength and defiance. The house seemed to exhale, around her, walls creaking in rhythm with her heartbeat. Eleanor understood that Marielle had left a legacy, not through overt fame, but through persistence, presence, and careful acts of autonomy. The recognition of that strength, Eleanor realized, was itself revolutionary. To witness it, to internalize it, to carry it forward, that was now her responsibility. When Eleanor finally left the gallery, she carried with her a sense of purpose she had not known she possessed. The whispers of the house, the murmurs beneath the floorboards, and the intimate voices in hidden letters all converged into a singular clarity. She was part of a continuum, a line of women whose resilience and subtle rebellion had been preserved through memory, art, and courage. The portrait, quiet yet commanding, had reminded her of her own capacity to exist fully, to act deliberately, and to honor the lives that had paved the way before her. She lingered at the top of the staircase, looking back at the gallery one last time. The candlelight illuminated the muted faces of ancestors, and Eleanor felt the quiet strength radiating from Marielle's portrait pulse through the room. In that moment, she understood that recognition was not simply about seeing oneself reflected in the past. It was about acknowledging, learning, and continuing the legacy of defiance, courage, and subtle rebellion that history had too often tried to erase. Eleanor descended the stairs slowly, her steps deliberate, carrying the weight of knowledge and the intimacy of understanding. She realized the house itself was teaching her to notice the overlooked, to listen to quiet voices, to honor lives that existed beyond the records of history. And as she moved through the halls, the candlelight flickering softly against the walls, she felt a profound kinship with the woman whose eyes had followed her so insistently. Marielle's story, once hidden, was now alive in Eleanor's consciousness, a quiet revolution within the walls of the manor and within her own heart. By the time Eleanor returned to her room, the night was deep and still. She lay awake, her thoughts mingling with images of Marielle and the other women whose courage had been encoded in the house. She realized that these stories were not merely historical curiosities. They were blueprints for living, templates of resilience that could guide her own choices, her own small acts of rebellion in the world beyond these walls. The recognition she felt was more than reflection, it was inheritance, an inheritance of quiet strength, wisdom, and deliberate presence. The manor itself seemed to hum with approval, its walls vibrating subtly with the energy of lives long past, yet enduring. Eleanor understood that the portrait that watches was more than an image. It was a sentinel, a teacher, and a companion. It reminded her that strength need not be loud, that defiance could exist in the smallest acts, and that recognition true, Recognition was an act of empathy and understanding across time. As dawn approached, painting the gallery with pale gold light, Eleanor knew she would return, not just to see Marielle's eyes again, but to continue the conversation, to learn the lessons embedded in paint and ink, and to honor the legacies preserved in quiet defiance. And as she closed her eyes, she felt the pulse of the house around her, the murmurs beneath the floorboards, the whispers in the cedar chest, the attentive gaze of the portrait-all converging into a profound understanding that the past, though hidden, is never truly lost. Eleanor slept that morning with the knowledge that she was seen, understood, and entrusted. And in the gallery, Marielle's eyes watched patiently, awaiting the next encounter, ready to share courage once more, and to remind Eleanor that quiet strength endures beyond erasure, beyond time, and beyond the walls of any house. The language of the past. Dawn crept softly across the manor grounds, painting the gardens in muted shades of gold and rose. Eleanor stepped out into the cool morning air, the dew clinging to the blades of grass and the petals of flowers glistening like tiny jewels. The mist from the night hung low, curling between the flower beds and around the twisted trunks of old trees, giving the garden a dreamlike quality. Birds began to stir, their songs tentative, cautious, yet insistent, as if they too were testing the quiet language of the day. Eleanor walked slowly along the winding stone paths, her boots sinking lightly into the soft earth. She felt a deep, almost tangible connection to this place, more than she had ever experienced in her previous walks through the grounds. The whispers she had heard within the house, the murmurs beneath the floorboards, the soft voices of letters long forgotten, the gaze of portraits in the gallery seemed to accompany her here, carried on the delicate currents of morning air. They no longer startled her. They no longer caused tension in her chest. Instead, she recognized them as guides, subtle markers pointing the way toward understanding. The garden was a living archive of memory. Each flower, each vine, each carefully pruned shrub seemed to hum with the energy of those who had cared for it over generations. Eleanor paused near a small fountain, its waters still cool and clear, reflecting the soft dawn sky. She knelt, letting her fingers skim the surface, feeling the gentle ripple travel upward and outward, as though the water itself carried messages from the past. The whispers returned here, mingling with the gurgle of the fountain, forming patterns she could almost decipher. She realized that the past was not speaking to scare her, nor to admonish her. It spoke to remind her of continuity, to show her the intricate web connecting all who had lived and all who would come to inherit the space. Eleanor wandered toward the roses, now wild and unrestrained, their petals dusted with dew and the soft remnants of mist. She remembered tending these same roses as a child, guided by her mother's patient hands, learning the care necessary to cultivate beauty from thorn and soil alike. The whispers seemed to echo that memory, merging the voices of her childhood with the long-lost voices of women who had walked this garden before. She heard soft laughter, gentle reprimands, murmured secrets of hope and endurance. These were not warnings, but invitations, inviting her to listen, to learn, to become part of the ongoing story of the house and its grounds. As Eleanor moved along the path toward the edge of the garden, where the morning fog thickened among old stone statues and ivy-wrapped trellises, she came across a small bed of lavender. Its fragrance was sharp in the cool air, grounding and familiar, yet tinged with the sweetness of memory. She knelt among the blooms, brushing her fingertips across the flowers, and realized that the whispers were more than sounds. They were the language of the past, encoded not in words alone, but in presence, in gesture, in touch, in subtle interactions with the world that remained. She felt a profound sense of healing wash over her, a release of tensions she hadn't even known she carried. The garden was alive with stories. Eleanor could see it in the bending of branches, in the careful arrangement of stones along pathways, in the thoughtful placement of benches beneath flowering trees. Each element bore the mark of human care, of intention, of continuity. She realized that those who had lived before her were speaking not through admonition, but through guidance, through the order of the garden, the patterns in which flowers had been planted, the spaces created for reflection and rest. They were teaching her that life was not a series of disjointed moments, but a continuous flow, a delicate balance between action and stillness, memory and presence. Eleanor's attention was drawn to a small, moss-covered statue at the garden's far corner, depicting a woman holding a book close to her chest. She knelt before it, tracing the lines of the carved hands, the delicate folds of the dress, the serene expression on the face. She felt again the whispers, soft and layered, as if the statue itself were speaking. Remember us. We are part of you now. Listen and live fully. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the voices mingle with the rustle of leaves and the faint call of birds, and felt a quiet, pervasive sense of acceptance. The past, she understood, sought not revenge or lamentation, but remembrance, a gentle acknowledgement of lives that had been lived and choices that had been made. She rose and moved further into the garden, toward the small orchard at the far edge of the grounds. The trees were heavy with fruit, the branches drooping slightly under the weight of apples and pears. The ground littered with petals and fallen fruit from the night before. Eleanor picked a small, ripe apple from a low branch, the skin cool and taut in her hand, and took a small bite. The taste was crisp, almost startling in its immediacy, and she felt a shiver of connection, not just to the orchard itself, but to the hands that had tended it over centuries. She imagined the women who had planted, pruned, and harvested these trees, their actions deliberate and purposeful, their labor a testament to patience and care. Their lives had been small in the eyes of history, but their influence endured in every leaf, every blossom, every fruit that now met her hand. The whispers became clearer as she walked through the orchard. They were no longer fragmented, hesitant, or fearful. Instead, they formed a gentle chorus, subtle yet distinct, carrying advice and comfort, laughter and encouragement. Eleanor felt that she could respond silently, inwardly, acknowledging the guidance being offered. Move carefully, speak honestly, cherish what is fleeting, they seemed to say. Honor the cycles of life, respect the hands that came before, and know that your presence matters. Each word resonated deeply within her, affirming the continuity of life, the interweaving of generations, and the responsibility of those who came later to honor what had been preserved. Eleanor paused at the edge of the orchard, looking out over the garden as the first full rays of sunlight pierced the mist. The flowers glowed with dew, the fountain shimmered, the statues gleamed faintly with moisture and light. She realized the house and its grounds were a living language, a carefully constructed dialogue between the past and present. Every whisper she had heard inside the manor, every hidden letter, every attentive gaze from a portrait-hole were part of the same conversation. Now continuing in the open air of the garden, she knelt once more among the lavender, planting a small seed she had carried in her Paquita symbolic gesture, a commitment to continuation. The whispers welcomed it, gentle and approving, blending with the rustle of leaves and the hum of morning insects. Eleanor felt a profound sense of participation. She was no longer merely a visitor, an observer, or a passive recipient of memory. She was now a caretaker, a witness, and a contributor. Her actions, small as they might seem, were extensions of the lives that had come before, gestures that honored and continued the legacies embedded in the house and garden. As the sun climbed higher, Eleanor walked along the winding paths, observing the patterns of light and shadow. Each step she took seemed purposeful, guided by the murmurs she had learned to understand, now unmistakable in their intent. She listened not just with her ears, but with her mind and heart, interpreting the language of the past with empathy and reverence. She recognized the profound lesson. Life was not only about survival or memory, but about continuity, about being conscious of the threads that connected past, present, and future. She lingered near the small pond at the center of the garden, the water smooth and reflective, mirroring the sky and the silhouettes of the surrounding trees. Eleanor knelt at its edge, dipping her fingers into the cool liquid, watching ripples expand outward. The whispers spoke in cadence with the ripples, their rhythm steady and reassuring. "Your life is not separate from ours," they said. "You are the next voice in our conversation. Carry it with care and love." Eleanor smiled softly, feeling tears prick at her eyes. The garden had become more than a place of beauty. It was a sanctuary, a space of reconciliation, understanding, and healing. For hours, Eleanor wandered the garden, listening, touching, observing, and reflecting. She traced the paths with care, acknowledged each flower, each tree, each statue, as if greeting an old friend. She felt the voices not as shadows of regret or echoes of sorrow, but as living guidance, teaching her to see and hear the subtleties of life. Each whispered lesson became a balm for old fears, a remedy for isolation, and a reassurance that she was not alone in her experiences. As the morning waned, Eleanor paused at the stone bench beneath the oldest tree in the garden, a sprawling oak whose trunk had withstood centuries. She sat, closing her eyes, and allowed herself to absorb the full language of the past. The whispers were gentle but insistent, carrying wisdom and history, caution and encouragement. She realized that remembrance was not merely about honoring what had come before, but about actively engaging with it, allowing it to shape choices, behavior, and perspective in the present. Eleanor understood at last that the whispers were not warnings, they were not judgments, they were guidance, soft but persistent, inviting her to live fully while remaining aware of the legacy she inherited. The past sought remembrance, not revenge. It sought engagement, not fear. And in that realization, Eleanor felt her heart expand with a quiet, steady joy, a sense of healing and acceptance she had not known she could attain. As the sun reached its zenith, bathing the garden in warm, golden light, Eleanor rose from the bench. She looked out across the garden one last time, inhaling the scents, absorbing the textures, feeling the pulse of life sustained over generations. The whispers lingered, no longer ephemeral or distant, but tangible companions, guiding her steps, informing her choices, and offering an enduring presence. She understood, finally, that she was now part of the language of the past, a continuation of memory, care, and life. With a deep breath, Eleanor turned back toward the house, feeling the continuity of existence in her steps, the healing in her heart, and the quiet confidence that the whispers of the past would always accompany her. The garden, the house, and the voices within them were now one with her consciousness, a living conversation that extended backward and forward in time, reminding her that remembrance was the ultimate act of love, and that the past, when truly heard, could guide the present with grace, patience, and enduring wisdom. When the whispers fade, morning light poured into the manor with a gentle insistence, spilling over the worn floors and illuminating the faded grandeur of walls and furniture alike. Eleanor stood in the great hall, the warmth of the sun brushing her face, her hair catching golden threads in the light. The house seemed to breathe around her, settling into a rhythm that felt both ancient and immediate, as though time itself had finally aligned with her presence. After nights of listening, wandering, and uncovering the secrets hidden in walls, portraits, and floorboards, Eleanor understood at last the profound task she had accepted: to preserve, honor, and restore not just the house, but the lives that lingered within it. She walked slowly along the hallways, her hands grazing the surfaces of tables, banisters, and doors. Dust motes floated in the sunlight, tiny particles of memory suspended in air, each one a fragment of life preserved within the walls. She paused before a long corridor, recalling the whispers beneath the floorboards, the letters in the cedar chest, the portraits in the gallery. They had spoken to her of resilience, courage, subtle rebellion, and the quiet acts of living fully, even when unseen. Now she understood that her role was to give these stories a voice, to ensure that the energy of the house, the presence of those who had walked it centuries before, would not fade into silence. Eleanor knelt at the base of the staircase, her fingers tracing the worn grooves of the wood. Each indent and curve spoke of countless footsteps, each a testament to lives lived within these walls. The whispers, which had guided her so far, were softer now, gentler, as if sensing that their stories had been acknowledged. No longer fragmented or urgent, they floated through the hallways like a quiet hum, a confirmation that Eleanor's presence was meaningful, that her intention to restore and preserve the manor resonated with the legacy it held. She began her work that morning with careful attention. The library, which had once seemed somber and closed, now became her first project. dusty tomes were cleaned and organized, their pages examined for notes, inscriptions, or annotations left by previous residents. Eleanor discovered delicate sketches tucked between volumes, small handwritten reflections in margins, pressed flowers that had survived decades, and even fragments of old letters she had overlooked before. Each discovery was catalogued with reverence, and she began transcribing these histories into a journal she would keep, recording not just the facts, but the essence of the lives they represented. The garden, bathed in the morning sun, called to her next. Eleanor walked among the flower beds, pruning where necessary, planting where the soil was ready to receive life. She tended to the roses, the lavender, and the small orchard trees with patience and care, imagining the hands that had shaped them generations ago. The whispers merged with the gentle rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds, forming a harmonious melody that seemed to approve of her efforts. It was in the act of tending removing the dead, nourishing the living, that Eleanor felt closest to those who had come before, honoring their presence through careful attention and continuity. Throughout the house, Eleanor found herself drawn to the portraits, each one a silent witness to the lives within the manor. She cleaned the frames with soft cloths, polishing the surfaces to reveal the faces more clearly, breathing new life into their gaze. When she reached the portrait of Marielle, the woman with her Eleanor lingered, placing a hand gently on the frame. She felt a warm pulse, subtle but undeniable, as if recognition passed from canvas to human skin. In that moment, Eleanor realized that restoring the house was not only a physical task, but also a spiritual one. She was restoring visibility and voice to lives that had been deliberately minimized, ensuring that courage, strength, and quiet rebellion would not be forgotten. The whispers responded to her presence differently now. They were no longer tentative fragments or anxious murmurs, but a calm, measured chorus, speaking in rhythm with her movements. They guided her hands in places that required delicate care, offered encouragement when tasks seemed overwhelming, and reminded her to pause and reflect, to honor the energy of what she was tending. Eleanor felt as though the house itself had begun to recognize her as its steward, an active participant in the preservation of memory and life. She discovered small corners and hidden rooms she had overlooked in her earlier wanderings. Each space contained objects left behind, simple furnishings, tools, personal items that told stories of daily existence. Eleanor cataloged them with care, cleaning and arranging each with consideration for its history. In one small attic nook, she found a bundle of letters addressed to women whose names had been erased from family records. She carefully unpacked them, reading the delicate cursive and preserving the contents in her journal. She began a small archive, ensuring that these voices would be accessible to future generations, that the hidden histories would remain alive, not just as memories, but as tangible lessons in endurance, empathy, and quiet courage. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Eleanor paused to rest in the great hall. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long, warm beams across the floor. She sat in a worn chair, the leather softened by years of use, and reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The whispers had guided her through fear, curiosity, recognition, healing, and understanding. They had helped her see the past, not as an oppressor or a source of regret. She realized that she had become part of a continuum, an inheritor of the house's memory, and now a guardian of its legacy. The manor seemed to respond to her awareness. Floorboards creaked softly in acknowledgement. Doors shifted slightly in gentle currents of air, and faint light glimmered across portraits as if highlighting their approval. Eleanor understood that the house, like her, had found a measure of peace. The whispers were fading, not because they were vanishing, but because their purpose had been fulfilled. They had been guiding her to this moment, ensuring that the lives they represented would be remembered, honored, and carried forward. Eleanor moved toward the staircase that led to the gallery, pausing before the portraits of ancestors whose eyes had once seemed distant or severe. She placed her hand lightly on each frame, whispering words of acknowledgement and gratitude. In return, the house exhaled a deep, satisfying sound, like the settling of centuries into harmony. The whispers, which had once filled the halls with urgency, now floated like a delicate veil, barely audible but infinitely reassuring. They had softened because Eleanor had accepted the responsibility of stewardship, chosen to preserve rather than abandon, to listen rather than fear, to act rather than hesitate. She spent the remainder of the day moving through the manor, tending, cleaning, and organizing. She restored the small sitting rooms, arranging furniture and fabrics with an eye toward the comfort and dignity of those who had once lived there. She polished silverware and china, each piece a testament to the lives of the women who had prepared meals, served guests, and preserved the household with patience and care. The act of restoration became ritualistic, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. Eleanor felt herself merging with the essence of the house, her consciousness entwined with the histories it held, her spirit aligned with its quiet dignity. As evening approached, Eleanor stepped into the garden once more. The sky had shifted from gold to pale rose, and the wind carried the faintest scent of lavender and damp earth. She walked along the winding paths, her hands brushing lightly against leaves and petals, feeling the energy of life that had persisted across generations. The whispers had all but disappeared now, leaving only a soft, ambient, humby, quiet satisfaction of stories preserved, of voices acknowledged, of memory honored. Eleanor understood that the past was not gone, only transformed. It had found peace because she had accepted its language, internalized its lessons, and committed herself to continuity. Finally, Eleanor returned to her room, carrying a small journal, the transcriptions of letters, and her own reflections. She placed them carefully on a table beside the window, letting the last rays of sunlight filter over the pages. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a resonance that reached beyond the physical space of the manor and into the continuity of life itself. The house, once a vessel of whispers and secrets, had become a home, alive with memory, respect, and love. Eleanor sat by the window, gazing out over the gardens now glowing in the evening light. She understood that she had made a choice, not just to stay, but to inhabit the manor as a conscious participant in its ongoing narrative. She had accepted the responsibility to give voice to the forgotten lives within its walls, to honor what had been erased, to preserve continuity. The whispers were now silent, not because they were lost, but because they had fulfilled their purpose. Their energy, once urgent and insistent, had merged with Eleanor's own actions, leaving the house in a state of gentle, enduring peace. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of of the setting sun on her skin, the faint pulse of the house beneath her, and the quiet legacy she now carried. The rooms, the garden, the portraits, and the letters all had become part of her consciousness. Their histories entwined with her choices, their voices preserved through her stewardship. Eleanor understood that life itself was a continuum, a living dialogue across generations, and that her presence, her attention, and her care had ensured that the stories of the past would endure. When Eleanor finally lay down to sleep, the manor settled fully around her. Floorboards no longer murmured, walls no longer whispered. The air was calm, suffused with a sense of completion, a gentle acknowledgement of care received and returned. The house had found its peace, and Eleanor, in turn, had found her purpose, her connection to those who had come before, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had become part of the enduring legacy of the manor and the lives it preserved. In the stillness of night, Eleanor dreamed not of shadows or voices, but of continuity. She imagined women moving through the corridors, tending gardens, reading letters, polishing silver, and laughing softly in the candlelight. She imagined Marielle's eyes, watching, approving, guiding, and she felt, finally, that the whispers had faded because they were no longer needed. Their language had been understood, their stories preserved, their legacy secured. The house, at last, was at peace, and so was she. The house rests, the stories linger. You have walked its halls, you have felt its past. Remember, even silence carries meaning. Close your eyes now and drift into dreams.